The CQ-12T digital mixer from Allen Heath is quite frankly a technological masterpiece, and it's extremely versatile, but it's also extremely complex. And, well, it's not cheap either. So in this video, yes, I'm going to go over the features and give you an overview of how it works, but perhaps more importantly, I'm going to talk about whether this mixer is right for you. Does it work for small venues like clubs and churches? Does it work for home studio? Does it work for live streamers, podcasters, and content creators? Who is it perfect for, and who should skip it? And I'm going to talk about alternatives if the CQ turns out not to be a good fit for you. And there's one thing about the CQ that just drives me nuts. And now it's not a deal breaker for me, but I wish they'd done one thing differently. But I'll get to that. Allen Heath loaned me the CQ-12T, and unfortunately I have to return it in a few weeks. I'm not getting any free stuff for this, and I'm not getting paid to review this. Now, the most obvious thing about the CQ series is that there are no knobs. Well, okay, there's one knob, but if you're used to every channel having dedicated physical knobs, then you might be worried about everything being handled via a touchscreen. And I'll talk about why that might be a big deal and why it might not be as well. But first, let me give you an overview. The CQ-12T, which by the way is the smallest of the three CQ series mixers, it has 10 mic inputs, which, I mean, is pretty impressive. 5 of those are combo inputs that allow line level 1/4 inch inputs as well. You can see them right there. And you can assign phantom power individually per XLR input, which thankfully, because otherwise, can you imagine just turning phantom power on for everything? That would be a disaster. That works for small interfaces, not for something like this. And so there's also one stereo line level 1/4 inch input, which is where the 12 comes from, I think, on the CQ-12T. Now, you can get additional inputs from Bluetooth, your computer via USB, and you can even play audio from an SD card. By the way, you can also record audio to an SD card. And if you have audio on a USB thumb drive, you can even plug that in right there. For outputs, you of course have a stereo main mix. It's XLRs that would be going to the house PA system or your monitors. And you also have 6 monitor outputs, so you can send customized monitor mixes to each of your band members. And there's even a phone app called CQ for You. Yeah, I didn't come up with that title. That allows users to adjust their own monitor mixes remotely. Speaking of apps, Allen Heath also offer the CQ Mixpad app, which works on iOS and macOS and Windows and Android and, well, that's it. But that's quite enough. So you can use a tablet, you can use a laptop, and you can have complete control over the CQ-12 or any of the CQ series remotely. Speaking of outputs, you can also record your mixes to an SD card. You have the option of either recording a stereo mix or the individual multi-track stems. The CQ series is pretty flexible, but it's also a very complex set of mixers, and it might be pretty intimidating to a new user. But fortunately, the mixers have sort of a beginner mode that hides some of that complexity behind a electronic curtain, if you will. Every input channel can be assigned as either a quick channel or a complete channel. And if you've got a quick channel assigned and you decide you need more control, well, you just convert it to a complete one, and then you can adjust every single parameter. I think Allen Heath is very aware that this mixer could be overwhelming, so they've taken steps to make it easier for the new user. And along those lines as well, there's a quick start button on the home page, and this provides you with common setups for different purposes. There's setups for rock and pop and country and jazz, but also interestingly, there's a conference setup, so it's aimed at like an all microphone session, and you can also set up all the channels as making them all quick channels or all complete channels with just one push of a button. Each channel has its own chain of effects that you can use or disable if you don't want to use them. So you have a high pass filter, and again, this is on each input channel, right? So you've got a high pass filter, which feeds into a noise gate and then into a parametric EQ. And finally, at the end of it, you've got a compressor. If you have the channel set up as a quick channel, you have sort of application-specific setups that are really simple, like for bass guitar or synth, it's sort of like 3 buttons and a knob or whatever. And if you have the channel set up as a complete channel, then you have access to all the individual parameters. You also have a separate effect chain for each output, you know, the 6 monitor outputs, so that way you can process the audio going to the musician's monitors or their headphones on a custom individual basis. You have a different chain of effects here, though. You can select either a graphic or parametric EQ, and that leads into a feedback assistant, and that can be used to squash feedback. And then that leads into a compressor and then a limiter. You also have the option for more powerful effects that you can either assign to an individual channel as an insert, or you can send signals from multiple channels to the same effect. Like, you turn up the sends on a couple of channels because you want reverb on all of them. So that's how you would do that. And you can use 2 of these effects at one time, and you get quite a few choices. So I'm actually going to demo some of them here. Hang on. Let me get my headphones on here so I can hear them. This is called Easy Reverb. This is Echo Verb. And this is Space Verb. Ooh. This one is called Echo Delay. And it's got a tap delay. Tap delay. Tap, tap, tap delay. Your basic stereo delay. You got a beat delay. Where you can set the tempo. And this is a double tracker, which simulates multi-tracked vocal performances. And you also have a chorus, and I'm going to crank up the rate on the chorus there and make myself sound kind of queasy. You have a flanger. Oh, come on, we can flange more than that. That's flange till things go crazy here. Okay, we are definitely flanging now. And we've got a phaser or phase shifter. And am I peaking there? No, I'm good. Okay. And of course, those effects have multiple settings that you can change around. And when you include all the channel and output specific effects as well, that's a lot. This mixer series also offers scene automation, which is, I think, one of its most powerful features. With this, you can instantly recall completely different mixer setups. And you can save up to 100 scenes per show, and each show is basically the bank of scenes. You can recall these manually one at a time, or you can step through them sequentially, and there's even a foot pedal insert so that you can step through them just by tapping your foot. So this allows you to pre-program different mixer setups for different songs in your live set. Now, this would also be useful in theatrical productions or anywhere where you need different setups during a show and you repeat them regularly. Now, there's only one headphone output on the CQ-12 right here, but since you have 6 line outputs to send to monitors or, headphone amps, that might not be an issue. You can also monitor individual channels in your headphones by tapping the headphone icon at the top of the channel. And this isn't going to interfere with your mix, and it's going to allow you to preview levels and effects on a channel before you send it to the main output. One other nice feature is the gain assistant. This will automatically set your gain for you during sound check. You just turn it on, you have the singer or instrumentalist play for a little bit, and then the CQ sets your level. And then you just turn it off, or actually it kind of turns itself off when it's got your level. And separately, you can turn on the auto gain function at any time during a performance. This will monitor the input levels, and it's going to reduce them downward if they're getting too loud. And no, don't worry, it's not going to boost them up if the input gets too quiet, because wow, that could just be a disaster. Having an auto gain feature is pretty useful, and I think this is a good time to start talking about the bigger picture with this mixer. Is this mixer right for your situation? Now, before this guy arrived, I imagined that I would be bothered by the lack of dedicated knobs, and the last mixer I reviewed from Allen Heath was the ZI-8, and it's a one knob, one function analog mixer. I kind of envisioned this mixer might make live sound engineers nervous because they didn't have faders to grab if something went wrong. But considering the auto gain monitoring and the feedback assistant features, I think that worry of your show going haywire is not eliminated, but at least significantly reduced. Now, selecting a fader does require an additional step or two, at least as compared to an analog mixer. So if you're not on the fader page, like let's say I'm on the config page or whatever, and then to select a fader, you'd have to tap the fader button, and then you can view half of the faders at a time because you've got tabs. So like maybe you need to select the other tab if that wasn't already selected. And then you could either just drag the fader or you can tap it and use the knob. So, I mean, there's a couple of extra steps. And that is perhaps the biggest trade-off with this mixer. If you want dedicated knobs at this price point, you're not going to have automation, at least nowhere near as robust as what this mixer can do. If you find yourself constantly writing your faders for creative reasons, then maybe this mixer isn't for you. The fact that you could have different pre-programmed scenes, though, is going to be really useful for live gigs, and that's assuming you tend to have the same basic setup for each performance. If every mix is different, like if you have a new band every night at a club, for example, then maybe the scenes would be less useful. Or if you're constantly flying by the seat of your pants with your mixes, then it might be a hassle to not have actual faders to grab. But if you tend to do the same mix moves every performance, having an almost completely reconfigured mix at the tap of a foot pedal or just a tap of a button is a massive productivity hack. Even if you don't always do the same set list every night, having a bank of mixer setups that you can recall almost instantly, well, that's pretty powerful. So, who is this mixer for? And just as important, who is it not for? Well, putting the price aside for a moment, and I know that's a big ask right now, but this would be useful for small and mid-sized churches and nightclubs and other venues that provide music on a regular basis. And I think this would especially be useful for smaller theaters as well. Bands who need to provide their own sound system would also find this very useful. I mean, having your mix practically dialed in no matter where you go would certainly be a time saver. Heck, you could just patch into the house PA and you would never again have to worry about figuring out some unfamiliar mixer where half the channels aren't working in some little club somewhere. And 10 XLR inputs is plenty for a lot of live bands, and 6 monitor outs, that's more than enough as well. Having the built-in effects is also a plus, and it keeps you from having to lug around outboard gear to each gig. And since it's programmable, it's repeatable, and that makes setup that much faster. Conference organizers would also benefit from this mixer. Its auto leveling feature makes setting up a bunch of mics very easy, and it also has an auto mic mixer function. This is great for conferences as well as round table style podcasts, because it will automatically lower the level of unused mics and boost those where people are actively speaking. So what this does is it cuts down on background noise from those open mics, and it also reduces the likelihood of feedback. So home studio owners who regularly record multiple instruments or vocalists at the same time would also love this. 10 inputs can get the job done for the majority of recording sessions. Now, this mixer, I mean, it isn't cheap. It goes for about $900. And unfortunately, that might put it out of the range of some of the users who would benefit from it the most. Small churches and clubs, I mean, they just might not have the budget for it. And you can get a decent sounding analog mixer with 16 channels for about $500. If all you need is raw inputs and don't need repeatable setting changes and built-in effects, then I mean, this probably isn't for you. Also, smaller content creators like me and solo home studio artists, I mean, they might be better off looking elsewhere as well. Considering the cost, the feature set might be overkill for a solo studio. If you're recording to a DAW, then you probably don't need the built-in effects. Also, 10 inputs isn't necessary for that kind of situation, except maybe if you're recording drums. There are definitely more practical mixers if you're typically tracking only 1 or 2 instruments at a time. This is true for podcasters as well. If it's just you and you're always using the same setup, then this is way overpowered, and the price tag is going to put it beyond the reach of, hobbyists or new content creators anyway. And on the other side, on the big side, large venues and recording studios, I mean, they're going to need something with more inputs and more flexibility. This is not going to take the place of a professional mixing desk. So what could you get instead? I mean, something maybe a little cheaper. There are other similar mixers on the market, and ones that are, digital or virtual mixers with all the faders and the controls all handled in software on a screen. For example, there's the Soundcraft UI-16. It's got 12 mic inputs and it goes for around $560. However, it looks pretty bulky because it takes up 4 rack spaces. There's also the Behringer X-Air X18. I don't know why they repeat X so often, but it has 16 mic inputs and it costs about $570. And there's also the Mackie DL1608L. It also has 16 inputs and it goes for around $700. Here's the kicker though. The Soundcraft, the Behringer, and the Mackie all require that you supply your own iPad or tablet. If you don't have a tablet that you can dedicate to controlling the mixer, at least while mixing the show, if not permanently, then you've got to spend another $300 and up. At that point, you're right there with the cost of the CQ-12T. Also, if you're taking the mixer on the road or in a public space, you probably don't want to take along an iPad. It would be very easy to lose the iPad or have someone run off with it, and even if they can't actually use the iPad because they're locked out, what are you going to do about your gig that starts in half an hour? I would only go with one of those other machines if I already owned an iPad, didn't mind it spending a lot of time as my mixer interface, and I wasn't leaving the house with it. So for a certain subset of mixer needs, the CQ-12T really does hit differently. I think they've nailed the sweet spot. Oh yeah, what's my big complaint that I was talking about at the beginning? Well, it's the way they handle headphones. First, I mean, it would be nice to have 2 headphone jacks instead of 1, but also the headphone level is programmable for each scene, and I'm not sure anyone actually needs that. And the downside to that is that there's no physical volume control for your headphones. You have to tap and dial to adjust the levels. Now, yes, when you hit the home button, the headphone level is selected by default, so it's just home button, adjust, so it's not as many steps as selecting a fader might be. But if something suddenly comes squealing into my headphones at 130 decibels, I want to be able to grab a knob while I'm clawing off my headphones with my other hand. Now, there's one big question about the CQ series that I hear people ask over and over, and that's, how do you actually set it up to record or play back from a digital audio workstation? And since this is such a big question, I've actually made a separate video on just that topic. So if you're wondering how that works, click here and check it out.